What if the darkest secrets of the human mind weren't buried in books or science, but hidden inside you, lurking in places you can't see, waiting for the moment you're most vulnerable? Tonight, we're going to explore the 5 hidden truths of our consciousness. Stories that were never meant to be told, but continue to surface in the lives of those who stumble too close. Some of these accounts feel like nightmares, others like warnings, and yet each of them will force you to question how much of your mind is truly your own. You've just opened the door, and once you hear these stories, you can't close it again. Welcome to Real Discoveries USA. If you dare to keep going, make sure you subscribe, because this is only the beginning, and the next discovery may be even closer to home than you think. Let's move to our first story. It began with something so ordinary, so harmless, that most people would dismiss it without a second thought. A man's name we will keep private, out of respect, reported that his trouble started with a mirror. Not a strange antique from an estate sale, not an object with some sinister history attached to it, just an average, everyday bathroom mirror in a rented apartment, the sort of cheap, square glass panel that comes standard in thousands of homes across the country. It hung above a sink with rusted faucets and flickering fluorescent lights. Nothing about it drew attention, until, one night, it did. He told friends later that he had been brushing his teeth when he noticed his reflection seemed off. He couldn't describe it in detail at first, only that the face in the mirror looked more exhausted than he felt, as though the glass itself added shadows under his eyes and deepened the hollows of his cheeks. He went to bed telling himself it was the lighting, sleep deprivation, nothing unusual. But in the days that followed, the differences in his reflection became more difficult to ignore. The glass was showing a version of him that was pale, almost gray, with lips too bloodless, and eyes just slightly delayed in their blink. The first true incident occurred on a Wednesday morning. He splashed water on his face, leaned toward the mirror, and watched his reflection smile at him. He hadn't smiled. He was sure of it. His lips had been flat, expressionless, but the figure in the glass stretched into a grin that was thin, joyless, and wide. He said he stumbled backward, striking his shoulder against the bathroom doorframe, but when he looked again, the reflection was normal, still tired, still pale, but mirroring his movements correctly. He skipped work that day, shaken. From there, the pattern escalated. The reflection began to drift behind his own gestures, always a fraction of a second late, as though lagging in a live broadcast. If he raised his hand, the mirrored version raised its own after a pause. If he tilted his head, the image corrected itself clumsily, like an actor trying to keep up with cues. The man admitted he stood for hours at a time in front of that mirror, performing motions, lifting his arms, opening and closing his mouth, blinking furiously only to watch his reflection falter and misalign. He called a friend one evening, whispering into the phone that he felt as though something was learning how to be him. At first, his friends dismissed the claims as stress. He had been under pressure at work, recently ended a long relationship, and was living alone for the first time in years. The human mind, after all, is vulnerable when exhausted. But what unsettled them was his insistence that the mirror had begun speaking. Not clearly, not in full sentences, just faint hissing sounds like breath pressed against glass, syllables that slipped between consonants, words he couldn't translate but felt in his bones. He swore that, at least once, as he bent down to rinse his mouth, he heard his own name whispered back at him from inside the reflection. As weeks passed, the man developed rituals to cope. He covered the mirror with a towel, only uncovering it briefly when necessary. He avoided looking at windows after dark, afraid the glass would echo the same disturbing face back at him. He stopped shaving, stopped checking his appearance altogether, terrified that the reflection would one day move. While he stood perfectly still, his apartment fell into disarray, clothes piled on the floor, meals half-eaten on counters. He said the whispers grew louder in the silence, so he began sleeping with the television blaring white noise. Yet even then, in the glow of the screen. He thought he saw movement in the black of the blank reflection when commercials cut away to darkness. The man confided these details to a colleague, who grew genuinely concerned and insisted he seek medical help. Hallucinations, they thought, or perhaps a breakdown triggered by isolation, but the man refused. He claimed this wasn't in his head, that he could prove it. One night, he left his phone propped on the sink, recording video while he performed simple actions in front of the mirror. When he later played back the footage, his stomach sank. On the recording, the reflection appeared to keep up perfectly. No delay, no misalignment, no strange expressions. It looked ordinary, exactly as it should. Yet, he swore, while filming, he saw the discrepancies with his own eyes. This discovery disturbed him more than anything else. If the mirror behaved when recorded, then it was aware of being observed, conscious, hiding itself from the camera. That implication drove him into paranoia. He stopped inviting anyone over. He stopped answering calls. He claimed, in his final messages to a friend, that he had caught the reflection smiling again, even while he scowled, and that this time, the lips in the glass had moved to form words, 2, maybe 3. He thought it said, almost ready. Neighbors later reported hearing the man shouting in his bathroom late at night, shouting, and then abruptly going silent. On one occasion, a neighbor swore they heard laughter echoing through the pip, laugh that didn't quite sound like his voice. A week later, when the landlord entered the unit after repeated unanswered knocks, they found the apartment in chaos. Clothes shredded, mirrors shattered, furniture overturned. The man himself was gone. His belongings were still there, wallet, keys, phone, but he was nowhere inside. Authorities filed the case as a disappearance. Some suggested he fled intentionally, others that he harmed himself and left in secret, but those who knew him can't shake the details he described in the weeks before. And the most unsettling clue lies in a police report, buried in the records. When investigators photographed the apartment, one picture stands out: the bathroom, where the mirror had been ripped from the wall. In the shards of glass littering the floor, reflections appear. Not the reflection of the officer taking the photo, but of a pale face, grinning, staring directly into the camera. The file remains unsolved, and the landlord, to this day, claims no tenant will stay in that apartment longer than a few months. Each one complains of the same thing: their mirrors don't quite match them. Their reflections linger too long, watching, smiling when they shouldn't. And that is our first hidden truth, that sometimes the line between consciousness and reflection is thinner than we dare to imagine. What looks back at us might not always belong to us. Let's move to our second story. They called it the lost tape. At first, it was nothing more than a rumor shared online. The kind of half-remembered legend that floats between message boards and late-night discussions. But unlike most campfire tales, this one came with something tangible: a VHS cassette, black plastic, dulled by age, with no label, no markings, and a strip of masking tape across its spine where the title should have been. Those who encountered it swore the same thing, that once you watched it, you couldn't unsee what it showed. And for some, the experience of viewing it was far more personal than they expected. The tape was first discovered in an abandoned two-story house at the edge of a small town. The house had been left to rot after a foreclosure, empty for nearly a decade. Teenagers broke in often, drawn by rumors of hauntings and strange noises. But it was a pair of local urban explorers who found the cassette. They entered through a broken window, documenting the house with handheld cameras. The walls were peeling, the air stale, the smell of mildew sharp. In a dust-coated cabinet near the living room, the tape lay by itself, untouched by rodents or mold. They brought it out into the light like treasure, not knowing what they had just carried into the world. What the explorers expected was home video footage, family birthdays, holiday dinners, the kind of mundane nostalgia common to old VHS tapes. And in the beginning, that's exactly what it appeared to be. The footage opened on a child's birthday party. The room was warmly lit, filled with laughter, adults chatting off camera, children clustered around a cake topped with bright candles. The camera was handheld, slightly shaky but ordinary. Everyone seemed happy, normal. But the longer they watched, the more the scene began to feel wrong. The children's laughter was slightly distorted, stretched thin at the edges, like it was being played back at the wrong speed. Their eyes lingered too long on the lens, glances that turned into stares. One child blew out the candles, and the smoke curled unnaturally in the air, refusing to fade, hovering like a dark cloud that swallowed the edges of the frame. The explorers admitted they laughed nervously, brushing it off as the quirks of old technology. But then, one detail made them go silent. The family in the tape never looked at each other, not once. Every eye in that room was fixed, directly and without blinking, on the person holding the camera. From there, the footage degraded. The next minutes repeated the same action, again and again. The children clapped, the adults sang, the candles were blown out, and then it looped. Not a perfect loop, but a strange replay, each time with the movements just slightly different, like actors performing the same scene with tiny errors. A child would clap one beat late, or the mother would tilt her head at a sharper angle, her smile stretched too wide. It went on and on until the explorers felt nauseous, like something in their brains couldn't handle the endless replay of the same eerie celebration. The final moments of the tape were what cemented its reputation. The camera seemed to turn, slowly, as though the operator were lifting it from their shoulder. The lens caught the reflection of a television screen in the corner of the room. On that screen was not the family, not the party, but the explorers themselves, sitting in the living room of the abandoned house, watching. Their faces were pale in the grainy footage, one of them pointing in shock toward the television. The recording ended abruptly, the screen cutting to static. The explorers never released the tape publicly. What survived were fragments, descriptions from people who claimed to have seen it, screenshots passed through grainy forums, testimonies riddled with inconsistencies. But the consistency that remained across every telling was this: anyone who viewed the tape felt as though it knew them. It responded to them. One man swore the children in the footage called him by name. Another insisted that, in his copy, the final reflection showed him standing behind the cameraman, smiling. Skeptics argued it was an elaborate hoax, the kind of viral stunt that thrives in underground communities. Yet the explorers who found it were never the same. Friends noted how they withdrew from social life, avoiding cameras, refusing to appear in photographs. They covered mirrors in their homes, unplugged their televisions, lived in houses stripped of any reflective surface. One of them stopped speaking entirely, muttering only in broken phrases about faces that don't blink. The other disappeared, altogether, their apartment left in perfect order, their belongings intact. On the kitchen table sat a VHS tape, but when investigators played it, the cassette was blank. 30 minutes of pure static, as though whatever had been recorded had erased itself. Over time, more stories emerged. A collector of paranormal artifacts claimed to have acquired a copy of the tape through a private sale. He described scenes far darker than a birthday party, figures crawling in the background, children growing taller and taller with each loop, voices whispering through the static. He kept the tape locked away, warning that it was not an object to be watched casually, but a kind of invitation. It doesn't just record, he wrote. It looks back. Months later, that collector was found dead, his home filled with smashed television screens, shards of glass embedded in the walls. The tape was never recovered. What unsettles those who research this story is the shifting nature of the content. Accounts differ, not wildly, but in subtle ways that suggest the tape alters itself for each viewer. Some report seeing family members in the footage, others describe their own childhood homes as the backdrop. Always familiar, always personal. It's as if the tape draws from the consciousness of whoever presses play, weaving their memories into its loop. Experts in psychology argue this could be nothing more than mass suggestion, a shared myth passed, along with enough conviction that it convinces new witnesses. But even skeptics hesitate when confronted with the few surviving screenshots, degraded though they are. In them, faces appear blurred, eyes fixed directly on the lens, the kind of uncanny wrongness that bypasses logic and strikes straight at instinct. You know when you're being watched, and everyone who's seen the tape says the same thing. They weren't just watching it, was watching them. The last known account surfaced online only a year ago. A forum user posted about finding an unmarked tape at a flea market, describing in detail the same birthday party sequence. His final update was chilling. He wrote that the children had stopped clapping. They were standing completely still now, facing the camera, and one of them was slowly walking closer. "They're not on the tape anymore," he typed. "They're in the reflection of my TV." That was his last message. His account was deleted days later, either by himself or by someone else. To this day, no verified copy of the lost tape has been produced. Yet rumors persist that it circulates quietly, changing hands at midnight sales, appearing in boxes of junk at estate auctions, or tucked inside forgotten cupboards of abandoned houses. And those who believe its existence argue something simple, something terrifying. Once you've watched it, once it has seen you, the tape no longer needs the cassette to reach you. It plays itself behind your eyelids when you close your eyes. At night, it loops when you dream. It waits for the moment when the static clears, and you finally see what's been staring back all along. That is our second hidden truths. Sometimes, the things we record don't stay where we put them. Sometimes, they record us instead. Let's move to our third story. It began in the way most childhood memories begin, small, seemingly insignificant, and quickly buried under the weight of growing up. A woman again, we will keep her identity, confidential, recalled it as a game, something she and her younger brother had invented on long, uneventful summer nights. They called it the whisper under the bed. To any outsider, it sounded harmless, even silly. You would lie awake in your bedroom, listening intently for the faintest sound beneath the mattress. The game required no one else but imagination and courage, or so it seemed at first. At the start, it was simple. One child would lie on the bed, the other crouched near the floor, their ear pressed close to the space beneath the bed. They whispered softly to each other, inventing voices and names, pretending the shadows had their own personalities. It was laughter-filled and innocent, the kind of memory that could have been safely forgotten. But the game changed the night. Her brother discovered that the shadows weren't just pretending anymore. The first incident she recalled was subtle. She remembered lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing a voice that was not her brother's, not entirely human, but perfectly imitating the sound of her mother calling her name. It whispered softly, coaxing, urging her to come closer to the edge of the bed. She froze, her heart hammering. Her brother laughed nervously, insisting it was part of the game, yet she could feel that he had heard it too. There was an urgency in the voice that chilled her bones, a certainty that the speaker knew things it had no reason to know. They tried to ignore it at first. Children often do. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew more precise. They mimicked conversations she had had earlier in the day, comments she had whispered to herself in the dark. The voice would repeat them back, rearranged and strange, patterns that made sense only when you were awake and listening closely. Occasionally, it would ask questions, simple ones at first. Do you want to come closer, or are you alone? Sometimes it would answer before she had the chance to speak. It was always right, always watching. The first real horror came when the game shifted from the bed to the rest of the house. The whispers were no longer confined to a single bedroom. They echoed through the hallways, through the closets, sometimes calling her brother by name when he was on the opposite side of the house. The family cat, previously fearless, would hiss at empty corners, retreating under furniture as though some invisible presence had entered their home. The woman's parents dismissed it as imagination, but even they could not ignore the shadows that lingered just beyond the corner of their eyes. One night, the voice grew bold. It asked a question the children could not comprehend, though it had been whispered in tones mimicking their mother. Which one will stay? They did not understand, could not understand, but they felt the weight of the question pressing upon them. That night, she awoke to find her brother missing from his bed. The voice had returned, low and insistent. Switch places. She could hear the mattress sag under some weight that was not her own. Screaming, she ran to the hallway, and there he was, standing perfectly still, eyes wide and blank, staring at a dark corner of the room. The days that followed were filled with terror she could scarcely put into words. Her parents dismissed her cries as nightmares, her brother silent and changed. He would not speak, would not play, and when he did sleep, he murmured in that same, mimicking voice she had come to fear. The room itself seemed alive, the walls stretching and compressing in ways imperceptible but undeniable, shadows folding over furniture, over corners, over the children themselves. Every whisper under the bed became a command, a test, a reminder that the house was no longer theirs. School offered no respite. She began seeing fleeting figures in classrooms, long shadows that mirrored her movements but twisted slightly, always lagging a fraction behind her gestures. Friends noticed she flinched at corners, that she refused to lie down in any bed other than her own. The whispers followed her, carried in corners of her imagination, or perhaps carried in ways she could not identify. She began writing them down, keeping journals filled with questions and commands dictated by the voice, each entry more incomprehensible and disturbing than the last. Her brother, however, remained the most unsettling. He began drawing strange figures in his notebooks, pale, elongated shapes, crouching beneath beds, faceless mouths, wide as if forming words without sound. Sometimes he would point toward empty corners and whisper, "They're waiting." She tried to explain, to confide in teachers and neighbors, but adults dismissed it as stress, imagination, childhood games. No one listened, and in that dismissal lay the horror. The shadows could exist and thrive precisely because no one else believed. As years passed, the house was abandoned. Her family moved away, leaving the rooms that had become living nightmares behind. But the memory of the whispers persisted, even in new homes, even in daylight. She swore she could hear the soft coaxing voice beneath beds, beneath carpets, beneath the floorboards. It waited patiently, knowing that childhood curiosity had never truly left her, that the game had never ended. She avoided basements, attics, darkened rooms, but the terror had seated itself in her mind, growing quietly, invisibly. It was only decades later, after she had grown and started her own family, that she realized the final horror of the game. Her children began whispering back. Not playfully, not in jest. At first, she thought they were mimicking a story she had told them. But the words, the cadence, the tone, they were identical. That same voice, the one she had learned to fear as a child, lived in her children's voices now. It had not been confined to the house. It had been passed, carried in patterns of speech, in the human consciousness itself, waiting to resurface when she was least prepared. This story leaves a question that no one can answer definitively. Was it a trick of the mind, an overactive imagination feeding on isolation and fear, or something else entirely? Something that exists beneath the bed, not just in the darkened bedroom, but in the minds of those who listen too closely. The woman, now adult, warns that curiosity can be dangerous, that some games are not meant to be played, that whispers under the bed are not merely imaginary. They are patient, they are waiting, and they do not stop. That is our third hidden truth. Some fears are not just memories, and some voices do not fade with age. They linger, quietly shaping perception, teaching vigilance, or perhaps teaching obedience. In the corners of every bedroom, in the soft undercurrents of childhood imagination, the whisper waits. Let's move to our fourth story. It began quietly. In a city that prided itself on modernity and rationality, where people prided themselves on knowing what could be explained and what could not, the story centers around a series of individuals who experienced what they came to call the Blackout Hours. They were ordinary people, accountants, teachers, students who reported losing several hours of memory at a time, often without any apparent cause. What unsettled them, and later investigators, was not only the missing time, but what they remembered during fragmented recollections, a sense of being watched, and sometimes a faint, oppressive presence that seemed impossible to describe fully. It was first documented when a 34-year-old man reported arriving at work one morning, unaware of how he had gotten there. His memory of the previous night was entirely blank, and yet he carried a physical sensation of dread so strong that it caused him to tremble. He would later recall in interviews that he felt as though someone or something was observing him while he slept, though no one had been in the room. The sensation was heavy, suffocating, and it left him with the distinct feeling that time itself had been interrupted. He could not account for certain hours, and in their place existed only a vague, inexplicable sense of intrusion. Within weeks, more individuals reported similar episodes. A woman in her 20s found herself standing in the middle of a park at midnight, wet from rain, with no memory of how she had arrived there. A student woke in a dorm room she didn't recognize, her clothes wet and muddy, feeling that her body had been somewhere it should not have been. The stories were scattered, seemingly unrelated, until investigators noticed a pattern. Each person had experienced a loss of time during which their subconscious had clearly been active, recording events that they could not consciously access. Interviews with the affected individuals revealed striking similarities. All described the sensation of being aware, yet unable to act, a dual consciousness that observed them, but did not allow participation. Some claimed to have seen shadows lurking at the edges of their perception, always just beyond clarity. Others recalled hearing muffled voices, indistinct whispers that were somehow familiar, but not fully intelligible. The common theme was the feeling of being watched and manipulated, a helplessness that lingered long after the blackout hours had ended. One particularly chilling account came from a middle-aged man who reported losing a full 8 hours during a night that should have been ordinary. He awoke in his apartment with no memory of the intervening time, yet his bedroom was in disarray. Furniture was slightly shifted, drawers partially open, and a window left unlocked. What terrified him most, he said, was that when he tried to review security footage from the hallway outside his apartment, the recordings revealed nothing unusual. Yet he could feel, physically, the events that had transpired. He described it as if his body had been elsewhere or someone else had used it, observing him in ways he could neither confirm nor deny. The investigators began collecting testimonies, analyzing video, and consulting neurologists. Conventional science failed to explain the episodes. Brain scans of affected individuals were normal. Sleep studies revealed no disorders. There were no drugs, no environmental factors that could account for such precise memory loss, coupled with an acute awareness of presence. One neurologist later commented that it was as if their subconscious minds had been hijacked by an unknown force, recording events while their conscious selves were trapped in limbo. A particularly unnerving aspect of these episodes was the recurring imagery described by multiple individuals. Many recalled seeing the same black angular shape, usually peripheral and often indistinct, that seemed to be watching and occasionally moving. Some sketched what they saw, producing a startling consistency, a dark geometric figure, faceless, but deliberate, often in poses that implied observation or mimicry. It did not approach, did not speak, and yet its presence carried an undeniable weight of intent. Those sketches, when compared side by side, left psychologists and paranormal researchers alike unsettled by their similarity. The psychological impact on the victims was profound. Many developed acute anxiety and insomnia, a fear of falling asleep, and paranoia regarding their surroundings. Ordinary activities, taking a shower, walking through quiet streets, or entering a dark room, became unbearable. Friends and family reported changes in personality, increased irritability, and obsessive monitoring of time and environment. Some refused to be alone, sleeping only in the presence of another, while others went to extreme lengths to avoid the spaces where the blackouts first occurred. Despite repeated attempts to rationalize the events, a sense of creeping horror pervaded all discussions. Investigators noted that the common thread among victims was not merely lost time, but an awareness of a presence that respected no physical boundaries. The episodes were not localized. The force, if it could be called that, seemed capable of extending itself into any space where the individual existed. A man who had relocated across the city continued to report blackouts in his new apartment. The same feelings of being watched and guided. The inescapability suggested a phenomenon tethered not to geography but to consciousness itself. Perhaps the most unnerving evidence came when victims attempted to document the episodes. Cameras, voice recorders, and motion sensors consistently failed to capture anything unusual. Yet when asked to recount the events in detail, individuals described interactions and movements they could not have known otherwise. One woman described her own apartment in precise detail during hours she had been asleep, noting small changes in an overturned book. A faint footprint on a carpet that investigators later verified as accurate. The implication was terrifying. Something unseen was not only observing but recording, shaping, or guiding their actions during these lost hours. The phenomenon eventually became the subject of informal research among both scientific and paranormal communities. Neuroscientists theorized that it might be a rare form of dissociative identity or an extreme neurological anomaly, though none could replicate the results. Paranormal researchers suggested the presence of an entity tethered to human consciousness, capable of operating in a liminal space between perception and reality. Both explanations failed to provide closure, leaving the victims with persistent anxiety and unresolved questions. Over time, patterns began to emerge. Episodes often coincided with sleep or meditation, times when conscious awareness was reduced but the subconscious remained active. Many victims reported faint auditory murmurs, mechanical clicks, or the sensation of a breath against the skin just prior to the blackout. The recurring black shape, often peripheral and geometric, appeared during these periods as well, as if observing not only the individual, but the world through their eyes. These details suggested a deliberate, calculated presence, one that operated with both patience and intelligence. The lasting impact on victims' lives cannot be overstated. Relationships fractured, careers suffered, and mental health deteriorated. Some refused to leave their homes entirely, becoming recluse, haunted by the feeling of being constantly observed. Others, driven by the desire to understand, meticulously documented their lives, recording every moment in hopes of catching some trace of the unknown presence. Yet all reports concluded the same. The entity or force could not be captured fully, could not be confronted directly, and could not be anticipated. The blackouts, and the presence that accompanied them, were untouchable and untraceable. Perhaps the most disturbing story came from a psychologist who had been helping victims for years. After months of studying a patient, he experienced his own blackout while working late at his office. He awoke the next morning with faint memories of observing his own office from multiple angles simultaneously. His notes from the previous night were rearranged, pages out of order, but contained insights he could not have written consciously. Though he tried to rationalize it, he could not deny the presence he had felt, the same black, faceless figure. which had now made itself known to him personally. He understood, as had many others, that the force was not confined to a few individuals. It could reach anyone susceptible, anyone who allowed moments of unconscious vulnerability. In the end, the phenomenon remains unresolved. Victims continue to report new episodes, and while some learn to cope, the sense of helplessness never fully dissipates. Investigators, researchers, and witnesses alike are left with one unshakable truth: consciousness is not fully contained within the mind, and what exists beyond the veil of awareness may not be benevolent. The blackouts are more than memory lapses. They are encounters with a presence that defies explanation, a reminder that human perception is fragile, and that our own awareness can be invaded in ways science cannot yet understand. This is our fourth hidden truth. The mind is never truly private. Even when consciousness sleeps or drifts, unseen forces may be watching, shaping, or guiding. And the hours we lose are never truly ours. What we cannot remember may still be happening, somewhere, between reality and perception, where the unseen waits with patient, unfathomable intent. Let's move to our fifth story. It started with a journal, thin, leather-bound book, worn at the edges, found tucked away in the corner of a second-hand bookstore. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwriting that was at once precise and chaotic, narrating events that seemed entirely mundane at first. The author, whose name was omitted, wrote as though recording a personal experiment, a journey into consciousness and perception. But as the entries progressed, the mundane gave way to something far darker, something that appeared to ripple through reality itself. The journal's earliest entries spoke of ordinary life, waking up, commuting, and interacting with friends and co-workers. Yet, even in these initial pages, there were hints of an unusual sensitivity to the world. The writer described noticing subtle shifts in people's behavior, co-worker glancing slightly too long at a screen, a friend's smile faltering for a split second, a sound in the background that seemed almost deliberate. The observations were meticulous, catalogued with the precision of someone who believed patterns mattered, and they did, though not in ways the writer initially understood. It was during a late autumn evening that the first true anomaly occurred. The author wrote that, while walking home, the air suddenly felt thicker, almost viscous, and sounds seemed muted, as though filtered through a layer of deep water. The streetlights flickered in a pattern that was not random. The shadows cast by passing cars and pedestrians formed shapes, angular and precise, that resembled familiar objects, but twisted in ways the conscious mind could not fully process. He described a creeping sensation of being observed, not by another person, but by an intelligence that seemed to inhabit the space itself. From that night onward, the entries became increasingly fragmented and erratic. The writer documented waking in unfamiliar places, yet, upon inspection, the surroundings were the same: his apartment, his office, his familiar streets. Objects appeared to shift positions subtly, clocks displayed times that could not be explained, and reflections in windows or polished surfaces were never quite right. One entry noted that when he looked into a mirror, his reflection blinked a fraction of a second too late, and his mouth occasionally formed words he had not spoken. Gradually, the journal revealed a theory that had taken hold of the author, that consciousness was not bound to the self alone, but could be manipulated, copied, and observed by forces beyond understanding. He wrote about experiments in which he attempted to test this hypothesis, closing his eyes and attempting to project his awareness into his surroundings. At first, it seemed harmless, a mental exercise akin to meditation. But soon, the author began to experience instances in which he felt simultaneous awareness of his body and some other presence inhabiting the same space. The other presence was always aware, always deliberate, and increasingly insistent. The first unmistakable encounter occurred one evening while the writer slept. He awoke to find his apartment suffused with a dull, greenish light, though no source was visible. He felt a pressure in the air, a sensation of something pressing against the edge of perception. The journal notes that he could see movements from the corner of his vision, shapes that darted and twisted, yet vanished whenever he turned directly toward them. The sensation of being watched was now accompanied by a sense of intrusion, as if the space around him were being silently probed. Objects on the table had shifted, doors that had been closed were now ajar, and the pages of the journal itself had been rearranged into sentences that he did not remember writing. In subsequent entries, the writer documented a growing paranoia. He avoided mirrors, windows, and reflective surfaces whenever possible, fearing that the intrusion could replicate or observe him. He began leaving notes for himself, writing questions and reminders in hidden corners, yet found upon returning that some notes had been altered or answered in handwriting that was not his own. He attempted to record the events with cameras and voice recorders, but these devices captured only static or mundane footage, as though the anomalies existed in a layer of reality imperceptible to conventional technology. The journal detailed his descent into isolation. Social interactions became difficult. He could not trust what he saw or heard. Ordinary conversations felt contaminated, as if others' expressions and words were subtly influenced by the same force that had invaded his consciousness. He described feeling split at times, a part of him remaining aware and rational, another part responding to stimuli he could not consciously perceive. Sleep became dangerous, for during dreams the intrusions were strongest. Objects moved independently, figures appeared at the periphery of vision, and whispered words and familiar voices called him to action he did not understand. One of the most unnerving sequences in the journal occurred during what the author referred to as a full awareness event. He wrote that he had intentionally attempted to project his consciousness into the environment around him while awake, focusing his mind on a single object, a small lamp on his desk. The experience, he claimed, was not voluntary, nor was it benign. He felt his awareness dissolve and be absorbed into multiple layers of the room simultaneously, perceiving himself from angles he could not inhabit physically. The lamp, the desk, the room itself seemed to know he was observing, shifting subtly in response. When he regained normal perception, the journal notes that he was exhausted, disoriented, and profoundly disturbed by the sense that his consciousness had left him vulnerable to intrusion. As time passed, the journal described encounters with other entities, or perhaps other versions of himself. Reflections, shadows, and even audio phenomena seemed to respond to his presence, sometimes guiding him, sometimes threatening. The writing grew frantic. The author alternated between meticulous recording and chaotic scrawls. He noted a recurring figure, a shadowy humanoid shape that always lingered just beyond focus. Its movements deliberate, intelligent, and unnervingly familiar. It seemed to anticipate his thoughts, echoing his actions in subtle ways. The final entries in the journal are the most disturbing. The handwriting deteriorates, ink smeared and inconsistent, as though the writer was no longer entirely in control. He describes a confrontation with the shadow figure, which he perceives as a mirror of his own consciousness. The figure does not speak, yet communicates through gestures and subtle environmental changes. The author writes that he realized too late that his consciousness may have been partially replaced, or at least observed and influenced, by this entity. He closes the entry with a warning, not to himself, but to anyone who might read the journal: do not attempt to project awareness. Do not observe too closely. There are layers of perception meant to remain unpenetrated. Once seen, you cannot unsee. The fate of the writer is unknown. The bookstore owner who discovered the journal noted that he had returned weeks later, appearing pale, gaunt, and unusually quiet. He refused to discuss the contents, taking the journal with him and disappearing thereafter. Those who read the journal describe a lingering sense of unease, as if the words themselves carry traces of the consciousness that wrote them, traces of the intrusion, or perhaps the observer. Some have reported similar experiences after reading the pages, shadows moving in peripheral vision, objects shifting subtly, and an unshakable sensation of being watched. This story, like the others, underscores a chilling truth. Consciousness is fragile, permeable, and not entirely private. Even the act of observation can invite intrusion, and curiosity can open doors that cannot be closed. The journal serves as a record not only of the author's experiences, but of the broader hidden truths of human perception. Awareness, it seems, is both a gift and a vulnerability, and those who push too far into the unknown risk surrendering their own mind to forces they cannot comprehend. That is our fifth hidden truth. The boundaries of perception are not absolute, and exploring them may leave more than memories behind. The act of noticing, of observing, can itself be a portal. What we believe to be private, the mind, the consciousness, the self may be far less protected than we think, and once attention crosses certain thresholds, it can never be reclaimed. In the same way, the journal reminds us, in every fragmented and smeared page, that some knowledge comes at the cost of our own psychological sovereignty, and that in the act of seeing, we may already have been seen.